All right. Did I do enough on that? Because I don't
Now
want
you
to do
get to
any more.
talk about this,
What?
your favorite thing on the screen.
Yes. Well, my second favorite thing. My favorite thing is the last thing we're going to do. Um, okay, evolved over the last 6 weeks, we've discovered that um, this disease, well, the first week and 2 weeks it hit Europe, right? Because the Chinese they were just shit poor about telling us what this thing was, other than giving us, samples of it and saying, here's a sequence and things like that. Their clinical histories of the thousands that were affected weren't readily available to us. And so what we did know is that it was causing SARS, sudden acute respiratory syndrome, okay? And that it was a coronavirus. And with that information, patients were, coming into the hospitals in France and Italy and Spain with their lungs half filled with fluid and with fevers above 103, 104, and they were crashing. And so what do you do with a crashing patient? You take them upstairs and you throw them in the ICU. You check their pulse ox and you do the basics in supportive therapy because you have nothing else to give them, okay? You try to control their fever and you try to get them oxygenated. So what did we do? We started putting them on ventilators. Then the news spread that, oh my God, Italy's running out of ventilators. Um, what's the rest of the world going to do? Ventilators are expensive, et cetera, et cetera. Then it evolved that not just the lungs, but other organs and, even the blood was being affected. These patients were also being observed to have disseminated clotting. The clots were showing up as pulmonary embolisms. They were showing up as infarcts in the liver, heart, kidneys, GI, microinfarcts. There were patients losing circulation to the digits, hands, tips turning black, toes turning black. So all kinds of weirdness on the level of clotting and what we call the intravasculature. And then also when patients hit a certain stage of the disease, even before the pneumonia, their body was reacting with what we call a cytokine storm. So the cytokine storm is the immune system goes into sixth gear and just erupts with all of these mast cells, all of these white blood cells telling each other, there's a systemic infection, everybody to battle stations. And then it just releases all of these cell signaling chemicals, and you get this huge insurgent immune response. All right, so armed with all of that knowledge, smart people in the pharmacology world said, okay, well, docs, why don't we try what we usually try when we see this stuff? And that is when you see disseminated intravascular coagulation, clotting everywhere, let's give them heparin, low molecular weight, and let's see if we can control the clotting. In a number of patients, in a number of scenarios, again, an approved drug for an approved indication in a hospital setting, monitored by a multidisciplinary team, it worked. A lot fewer patients over the last 3 weeks have seen disseminated intravascular coagulation, resulting in all of these horrors, because more and more doctors are using the standard of care when it comes to clotting. Second, immune modulators. What can we do to prevent the cytokine storm? Well, we have monoclonal antibody therapy. We have something as simple as antihistamines. So one of the antihistamines that has long been used to treat GERD, as you know, GERD is it is indigestion, but it's just the regurgitation of stomach acid. So tamp down the stomach acid amounts. You give Pepcid. Pepcid's chemical name is famotidine. Tocilizumab as well as siltuximab are monoclonal antibodies that are modulators of interleukin-6. They are also showing effectiveness when given to COVID patients to prevent or to tone down the cytokine storm. And then the big guns, the antivirals, going after the source agent, which is the virus itself, are drugs from the HIV arsenal, as well as newer drugs. So remdesivir, you've heard of in the news. My assessment is remdesivir will be secondary to an agent called leronlimab. So leronlimab goes after the way that the virus actually enters the cells. So if you give leronlimab, it immediately stops the replication cycle, and the virus can't continue to reproduce itself. Remdesivir also has a similar interference in the life cycle of the virus, but it acts after the virus has already entered the cell. So it's one step later. And then another one, favipiravir, which is only available right now in Japan, in Asia. I think it's available in South Korea too, which may be coming here. It's also showing efficacy in interrupting the life cycle of the virus. So when you put them all together, you get trimodal therapy. And this is what is going to cut down mortality and morbidity in these patients. So for every 1,000 patients that go into the hospital 6 weeks ago, a certain percentage of them ended up with really bad course of disease because none of these were known to help. 6 weeks later, let's call it 8 weeks later, we know that they all have some efficacy, and when we put them together, their superpowers join, and they turn into a pharmaceutical Voltron. So, okay. So Sandra has a question about each of these drugs, and all of these drugs except for leronlimab, the ones in the middle, the antivirals, all of the other drugs have passed all of those controlled, blinded RCT for the indicated usage, just like hydroxychloroquine, but they are being used because of their molecular basis of their molecular mechanism of action. So we know exactly where they're working, and that's why we use them. Okay, and John always pushes me to the next topic before I've answered the last question. So Jenna is asking, what is the availability of trimodal therapy drugs? Specifically, do hospitals have adequate supply, and which ones are under patent protection? I can't answer your patent protection question. I simply do not know. The availability is what I described as the immunomodulators and the anticoagulants readily available. The antivirals, remdesivir, the initial batch of doses went to the hotspots. So I think 4,400 doses went to New York, and then another significant amount went to Miami, New Orleans, Chicago, and as well as San Francisco, LA. So wherever there was a potential usage because of high demand, that's where they sent it, which is great. And so we should have more data on whether it is useful and how useful it is and when and all, and dosage. And so remdesivir is under kind of a emergent trial right now. Leronlimab is in a much smaller use case scenario. So we'll figure out when that becomes more prominent and the data becomes more readily available. But one thing I'm proud of is John and I bring to you these words, these names, these concepts about 2 weeks before you hear them in the news. So you should be hearing about this kind of trimodal therapy and the drugs we're talking about shortly. But to fully answer your question, the practice of medicine across the United States is non-standardized. The academic medical centers will more likely have access to these drugs than your community hospitals. So it is not available everywhere, and not all the doctors across the country know about it.